Thanks, everyone. Thanks especially to Lee for organizing this workshop. It's really my pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Alabama as chair of the Department of Political Science. And so thanks for coming. We appreciate it. This has been really an insightful day. I'm going to admit that I feel a bit woefully inadequate here. And that last night was the first time I've seen an episode of Andor. And I came to Star. So as in terms of my cultural expertise, yeah, it's limited and lacking. I came to Star Wars actually quite later in life than most, and I remember like the first time seeing the original Star Wars episode and saying like it being fascinated like everyone with the technology and the visuals and all of that. Seeing the Empire as evil and deservedly punished, but then wondering about the rebels seemingly trying to instill a monarch. And so I remember wrestling with all those things with Princess Leia. But the connection here is that in my dissertation about 20 years ago now, was dissatisfied with the state of the literature and political science and media, and that it was focused and centered around news media and campaigns principally. Right. And so in that dissertation argue that these are, while important, not the media that most people are consuming. And so that took me on a voyage that was social media, 15 years ago, is something that I was looking at. And people at the time similarly were kind of dismissive of social media as a distraction, like Dr. Jackson spoke of earlier. And then also entertainment media. And so we did a study when I was at SIU Carbondale. We looked at the effects of exposure to the film Cider House Rules on abortion attitudes. And we looked at the effects of the film Wag the Dog, which advocated a conspiratorial message on conspiracy beliefs and found evidence that fiction can, in fact, change people's both political attitudes and political beliefs. And then 10 years ago now, worked with the project. So to the IR folks in the room, I can claim to at least have published an international studies review that looked at enemy images in digital games with Brandon Valeriano. And our argument there was, again, this is an oft source of entertainment for people and not looked at from a political lens. And we found, this is, by the way, the work was done prior to Russia's invasion of Crimea. And we found in this piece that Russia was the most common digital enemy that one encountered in games, in first-person shooter games. And so, again, like my interest here overlaps with the group, not so much in Star Wars per se, but under these general auspices that what people are exposed to in entertainment media shouldn't be dismissed, but rather can be formative in the ways that they think about politics. And so the talks today, the things I'm saying, I thought your discussions of people's use of memes to incorporate, I mean, really apropos to the kinds of work that I found really interesting and fascinating. And so thank you to each who have been here, and I won't belabor you anymore. I'll go ahead and get to my role, which is to introduce the two papers. So it's my pleasure to introduce, this is an all Alabama panel with chair and panelists.
All right.
And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessy Ohl, who will be presenting. Let me flip back to that second page.
Okay.
Third page, excuse me. A revolutionary waters the plants. I didn't want to get you. I thought I had it memorized, but wanted to make sure I had it right. So Dr. Ohl is Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Political Discourse at the University of Alabama, Associate Chair of Graduate Programs in the Department of Communication. He's published more than 20 peer-reviewed articles, and among other honors, Dr. Ohl has received the outstanding University of Alabama Graduate School Graduate Mentor Award. This is really a high recognition and excellence in community engagement scholarship award, another really important one. And so we're really pleased to welcome you and look forward to the talk. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? All right, how about now? Okay, great. That's a really good introduction because I consider myself to be a Star Wars fan, but to be completely honest, when I heard that Andor was being produced, I was really pessimistic. I was angry. I was fearful because I really liked Rogue One. And I'm like, damn it, can't you just leave a good story alone? Like, I just knew that they were coming for the last little bit of juice in that lime and that the story was going to be shit. And I was so thankful that I was wrong. And as much as I think about Andor as really good Star Wars, I've tried to make it as much of a personal mission to tell as many people as possible who aren't Star Wars fans that it's just really good and important storytelling. And I definitely think that one of the things that makes me so pleased with what we've been able to do today, and I'm so thankful for you, Waleed, and all the work that went into this, and everybody who's been involved, is that it really couldn't be more timely. And I think that people who are again not interested in sci-fi or fantasy or Star Wars are looking to Andor as a way of making sense of what's happening. And you know, even just a little bit ago, and maybe this part of the presentation could be blacked out, but you may have heard, you know, adulations and claps and cheers from next door. That was our president and our deans and our board of visitors learning about our new, you know, public relations push at the University of Alabama, that we are a flagship ready capstone, and that is the new sort of vision. And so while we're talking about that across just these sort of thin walls here, we're talking about politics and liberation and freedom. And I just am very thankful that that's happening, and that it's happening so close. So, so thank you again. Of the many critical questions that are posed by the series Andor, I am drawn to the subject of revolutionary affect. Andor is, in many ways, I believe, a story about the perils and possibilities of activation. It's a meditation on the emotional resonances necessary to spark, grow, and defend anti-authoritarian resistance against overwhelming odds. And while it might be obvious for us in rhetoric and IR that collective resistance, whether it be here and now or a long time ago in a galaxy far away, may very well hinge on the construction and circulation of affect and emotion, the precise constellation of bodily intensities of forces needed to defeat tyranny are far less obvious. So, what are the conditions of possibility for the development of the revolutionary subject? Which affects and emotions carry the internal dynamics needed to perpetuate resistant practices? Should we build a politics around Karis Nimmick's confident optimism, Saw Gerrera's anxious madness, Luthen Rail's subdued rage, Lonnie Jung's ubiquitous terror, Kayla Markey's conflicted love, or perhaps even Kay's irreverent joy? The audience is invited to explore these possibilities and more through the narrative arc of Cassian Andor. We witness Cassian move from peripheral victim of faceless empire to selfish survivor in the intergalactic colonial ghetto, to a reluctant leader of a band of thieves, and eventually to a true believer, a devout rebel adhered to a cause worth fighting for, worth dying for. His activation is by extension our own, a process of recruitment, an effective attunement, a transition away from indifference and despondence towards something else, a more alert, robust, attentive, interconnected defiance. It is a new, old hope. I want to reflect closely on a moment in the concluding sequence of the Andor finale that leads into the events of Rogue One. As some of you may recall, in the final scene of Andor, Season 2, involves a montage of sorts. Cassian Andor, now healed from recent wounds and liberated from self-doubt, prepares to depart for his next, and as we know, final mission. As he readies to depart the rebel base on Yavin, Cassian fastens his holster, secures his blaster, dons a leather flight jacket, and of all things, waters the plants. Yes, with blood on his hands and the weight of the entire galaxy on his shoulders, Andor pauses to quietly provide nourishment and care for two intergalactic succulents. When I saw this, I literally gasped. I was like, oh my God, it was such a quick, revelatory moment. And in the preparation for this, I found that there's actually a really cool subreddit that's just about this, like just about this one scene. And so it made me feel that I wasn't crazy or anything. But there's this just one comment that I think is just so beautiful. But it again from the Reddit, quote, as self-employed gardeners, the belt on, gun holstered, jacket equipped, plants water routine hit me and my wife right in the feels. So the peaceful moment itself lasts almost 3 seconds. It's almost infinitesimal considering all of the many things that this series is doing. And yet I really believe that it speaks volumes. Cassian's subtle gesture communicates his growth as a character and emblematically establishes nonverbal support for the recurring argument made in Andor regarding revolutionary affect, namely that rebellions are built on hope. The entire decision to have potted plants in a jungle is itself somewhat curious. And I had seen that again in this discussion online. There's apparently a little bit of evidence that Bix and Cassian travel throughout the entire show with plants, like they've taken plants. And so I haven't confirmed that yet. I'm gonna have to go back. That's it, but it's a small detail. They're like, oh no, these plants are with them the entire time. They're like part of their companions or their mementos, if you will. But in recognizing the needs of his plants and making the time to attend to their care before leaving the planet, Cassian performs an act of hope that is difficult to anticipate or recognize based on his character in the first season. Earlier versions of Cassian are far too busy, cold, isolated to care about most other living things, let alone plants. The act of watering demonstrates a profound new sensitivity, one that transcends space-time and can only flourish within the context of hope. Cassian waters to honor the memory of his adopted mother, Marva, who nonchalantly displays her horticultural proclivities in the first season. He waters in the present immediate moment to connect emotionally with his lost lover, Bix, and the life within his immediate proximity. Now, again, getting back to the subreddit, there's this other like little cool image. I'm sorry, I couldn't bring it up, but there's this meme where Cassian is listening to Bix's farewell, like the breakup video. And if you look at it behind him, that's where the plants are. And there's this meme that I found where somebody is like, oh, those plants are dead. Not survive a day without Bix. And then there are all these updates. They're like, no, Cassian stepped up. He's watering the plants. And so, yes, that was wonderful. But again, that's this sort of, again, like gesture of love, recognition of promise, of potential, of carrying on. Yes, and and poignantly, Cassian waters for the future, not knowing when or if he will return, and holding on to that responsibility. And I have become sort of the de facto gardener, planter person in my family, and I've gotten better at it over the years. But just as a quick little sort of moment about this future and the responsibility, my wife and I were traveling last year, and well, it was in the fall, early winter, and we were in Nashville, and the person who was like watching our dogs calls, and like, it's supposed to get cold tonight. Do you want me to bring in your plants right from outside? And I said, no, don't worry about it. I didn't want to bother them. I'm like, it's been pretty warm. It's only supposed to be cold for like a few hours. It'll be warm tomorrow. And I came back and had to just bury a lot of just beautiful, big, living things. And I just remember the shock that I felt that bad about it. You know, that there was something that was alive that was, for some reason or not, within my sphere of responsibility. I felt like a certain kind of duty, and to miss that responsibility, it really hit me hard in a way that like, and I told people about it, I almost cried. I got so mad at myself. And so when I see this sort of move that Cassian is making, it really sort of resonated with me in that moment. So in these, just again, really quick 3 seconds, Cassian shows he believes in the interconnection of everything, in a hopeful future, a bright day after Empire, even if he won't get to see it. And I think it's important here to recognize that this is not meant to be a kind of naive hope, or frankly, even not a non-violent one. Remember sort of the opening scene of Rogue One is Cassian reconnecting with an informant, a confidant, were coded as a friend who is shot in the back by him, right? So this is not necessarily a kind of passivistic hope or a disconnected hope, which I have concerns about. This is against almost sort of a hope that is a little bit more perhaps defensive or self-defensive. As a metaphor, watering and gardening maps well onto revolutionary discourse. We seeds of rebellion, terrorists as weeds, the tree of liberty, blood of patriots, blah, blah, blah. But as praxis and habitus, watering and gardening is instructive of revolution via hope. Nora Aswad, who's a colleague of mine in her analysis of the Syrian revolution, talks about hope as, quote, the bloom space for solidarity. And here we can think of that bloom space, I believe, in the broadest possible sense, as solidarity with all life, with all things, as the Force sort of instructs. Of course, there have been critiques and concerns about hope as cruel optimism, as Berlant will say, or its potential inertia in the face of authoritarianism. To be honest, I myself have been very torn, conflicted, unconvinced by hope as revolutionary affect. I am not especially hopeful right now, which is hard as a teacher at the end of the semester and as a relatively new father. And I do worry that hope as a type of rhetoric in politics may, without focus and attention, smuggle in a certain type of complacency, right? Sit back, watch. As such, hope might be as political as things can get in a Disney media ecology, or it might be the necessary telos to remain legible in global neoliberal capitalism. We must trust the process, trust the force. Hope, like gardening, involves a faith requiring a loose grip. And this is again something that I've personally learned in terms of doing right by something. If it's a plant, is sometimes a matter of restraint, not watering, not caring, believing. And I really connected earlier with some of the comments about creating the space for the force to do its thing. And I think I really do believe that that's really involved in that kind of, again, act, but also sort of in that sort of belief in or investment in hope. But as previously mentioned, Cassian's activation as a radical subject is meant to be, by extension, ours. And I do find hope in the fact that he, for some reason, has found hope. Clearly, for some of the other presentations, Andor has given people hope, right? We see that that hope has found its legs, is marching in the streets. And I do wish to sort of connect this notion of hope specifically to some projects that I'm aware of, East Coast projects used that are using sort of service animals and gardening to rehabilitate incarcerated populations. For those of you that have, worked with or thought about or read about, especially here in Alabama, where we have the documentary, The Alabama Solution, the carceral state is especially problematic here in Alabama. And so these efforts to sort of think about people who are imprisoned as always already themselves victims, right, is a really important sort of move. And you're seeing a lot of kind of these interesting activist sort of interventions to give people who are sort of stuck in these traps hope. And a lot of that is to sort of give them the opportunity to care for something else, right? Like whether it's a garden or whether it's an animal. And again, the discourse surrounding this is just so interesting to hear folks who otherwise would find no other reason to keep going find a reason to keep going in growing tomatoes, right? And having that be something that can not only provide a distraction, but rather a hope for the future and for healing. And so that's hopefully what I can we'll try to do maybe in the future with that kind of critical move. But again, thank you all for being a part of this. And like I said, this has probably been the most hopeful I've been in a while. So I appreciate everybody's help in that. Thank you.
Thanks. And for our last talk of the day, I get to welcome my colleague, Dr. Daniel Levine. This is one where I have even less expertise. I've not watched a lot of Star Wars, excuse me. So I'm like poorly chosen to be the chair, but I will say this, and that is Daniel is one of the people that every time after I have a conversation with them, I walk away feeling more intelligent. And so I'm looking forward very much to this presentation because I know I'll learn a lot on multiple levels. Let me just read the bio. So Professor Daniel Levine is Aaron Aronoff, Associate Professor in Judaic Studies in the Department of Political Science and Religious Studies. He's authored and co-authored articles in European Journal of International Relations, Perspective on Politics, ISQ, Millennium, Global Studies Quarterly, among others, and is the author of Recovering International Relations, The Promise of Sustainable Critique. His current work focuses on fear and former role in the early years of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and the weaponization of history, memory, theology, and global politics, and questions of reflexivity and representation in international political theory. He's with us while on sabbatical, having returned from Scotland and heading back there shortly. So we're just really grateful for his involvement here. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, got it. Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, I'm just gonna, rather than futz around with you, like how to do presentation split screen thing, you'll just have to look my little notes in the bottom to myself, and that way we'll just just kind of get through this and ask me whatever questions you want to. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you also for the opportunity to, there's a certain, like I said before, there's a certain kind of ecumenicalism here, because Star Wars is not really so much my jam, even though I do love my Star Wars, but I love my Trek more, and I'm just gonna have to, but the question is the question with all this stuff is why? Because I don't think that Trek is better. And in fact, I think I've said to a couple of you, most of the time when I was young, I spent a lot of energy trying to convince myself that Trek was in fact better than it was, right? Like there are a couple of really sublime episodes of Star Trek, right? And there's a couple of and then there's, Spock's brain and brain and brain, what is brain? And all these things that shall not be named, and yet we insist that this thing is important, right? And so the question was like, what can we learn about that, right? And why? And so this phrase in Latin, sentus incudentus ecclesiae, like things upon which the church rises and falls, or stands and falls, right? That there are certain doctrinal arguments that matter not because they really matter, but whether Jesus owned his clothes or not, right? And they matter because the earthly church is organized on something and not organized on something else. And all the bishops have to kind of know what they're saying, and everybody sort of needs to know what we're doing, because if we don't, then we can't actually do the stuff that we're supposed to do, right? And so the question is like, what do these things sort of stand and fall on, right? And if we think of, and then sort of the next question is, what comes from thinking about Star Trek as a kind of ecclesia, right? And I'll explain why I think that is a kind of community of belief. And I'll explain why I think that in a second. The archive that I'm going to be working with, and I'll say a little bit more as I go through it, is the letter column from the Star Trek comic book series in the 1980s. This is a DC comic series that was published from 1985 to 1989-ish. And I'll say a little bit more about where and when that comes. But anyway, this is the letter column, and you can. One of the things that was sort of unique and special and about this comic strip or this comic series we're told is that it tried to take Trek seriously. That its editors and its artists and its writers were all kind of Star Trek people. And so they tried to do a lot of fan service, and they also tried to do, so I don't talk too long. They tried to do a lot of fan service, and they also tried to innovate within the limits of the series, right? So there's one storyline that's written by Walter Koenig, the guy who played Chekhov. There's each of the sort of minor recurring characters, like Uhura gets her own multi-episode little thing. Scotty gets his own multi-episode thing. Sulu does. Many of them are kind of embarrassing. Sulu's involves like this future space Japan that is somehow also Meiji Japan, and it's all about honor and whether he will inherit his father's, trading company. And right, and then there's the sort of, I don't know, there's probably a word for this. When I was growing up, there's a kind of Hebrew lettering that was English lettering that looked like Hebrew words. It was called Mazel Tov. And it was only used in kosher restaurants and anti-Semitic canards. But we're saying it loud, we're black and we're proud, right? Like that's, so we're, but in any case, there's a sort of comparable Japanese and or Chinese characters looking English prose, and there's a lot of that, right? And and I don't know, and like they were actually in touch with the actor who plays Sulu is very active and stuff, and was I'm sure you all know was interned during the war, and right, and all these things have been talked about and are even already being talked about in this particular moment here. So I don't know what he thought about that, but my guess is that, like a lot of folks, they were trying, and at least they were trying. So then, why is all that important? Like, what are they trying at? And when I talked to Levine about this also, he said, make sure you tie this a little bit into Star Wars because not everybody. So what I want to sort of start from is this scene from Clerks, because I was, Philip mentioned that I was in the UK, so, Clerks. And this opening scene in Clerks, you guys might remember this film, right? But Randall and like these guys, they work at the sort of locally owned 7-Eleven type place. And Randall's got this problem, and his problem is that is not the first Star Wars, but Return of the Jedi, because the Death Star isn't finished, and they blew it up, and fine, they blew up all the stormtroopers. Cool, evil gets punished. They blew up all the evil droids. They blew up all the evil, officers with their ranky things. Like, fine, but the thing is under construction. So, like, there's roofers and there's plumbers and there's contractors and there's all these guys working on the Death Star. Especially here because they had to get it built quickly. So the Empire had to be contracting out for all that. And like these guys are just trying to put food on the table. They're just trying to keep body and soul together. And here come a bunch of left-wing lunatics, and they blow the place up. And like, what the actual F, right? And over in the corner is this guy, and he's just sort of getting coffee for himself. And he overhears all this, and he kind of looks back and he looks over. And as he's checking out, he says, "Look, just not for nothing, but I'm a roofer. And I got to tell you, whoever took the Death Star job, like, like a roofer roofs with this." And so what's important about like what is, so when I stop and I think about this scene, right? There is this sort of ironic or else satirical representation of a public sphere in which people can represent themselves, their interests, and their values in an everyday vernacular, and in which they can appear as themselves. And we don't necessarily need to have read Quintilian's Institute of Oratory to know how to make ourselves known to one another, to say what we believe, to be understood, and we can also arrive at some common sense of meaning, some common interpretive horizon as to what the world is, and that, happily is politics, right? And so the political in this notion, and we're thinking here in this sort of Arendt, Sheldon-Wolin tradition, right? Politics is this place where the world becomes your world by virtue of this common vernacular language that you share with everybody else, right? And by the way, that language can be like evil and racist and wrong, right? But it's so in objective terms, but subjectively, the people who are using it like it, right? Those of you who are familiar, like we don't need to think like we're in Alabama. We don't need to think very far back to make sense of this, right? There's a post-Civil War discourse that says that how does the North make up with the South? Well, slavery was really about economics, and also the Civil War was Black people's fault, and so we should all, the Anglo-Saxons of the North, the Anglo-Saxons of the South should just shake hands and call it good and let Andrew Johnson do whatever Andrew Johnson's going to do. And again, that resolution may or may not be good, honorable, ethical, or moral in any transcendent sense. I may or may not like it or agree with it, right? But it is immensely powerful. It exercises a great deal of nostalgia and a great deal of emotional pull. And like anybody who doubts otherwise, look at the politics that we're confronted with, right? Like these things have the value that they have. And that is the promise of politics, right? That you can create this world that whether or not it's true, it is not alienated to you as a citizen. And that must be, so what's happening here, what makes it ironic and or satirical, is that really that's not possible. That's what's being made fun of here, right? And Randall is actually kind of this character here, right? Like he's sort of like, yeah, I mean, I don't actually really care about all this stuff. I'm just sort of pretending to care about this stuff. I'm cosplay caring about this because I really just want to show everybody kind of like how clever I am. And also, isn't it all sort of silly and the other character, like he really believes. And, but what happens if in a slacker culture, if you really believe, it's a sign that you need a snack, right? And the whole film is about this person sort of getting abused because he continues to believe that society is supposed to work the way that it should, and Randall knows better, and we know better. But at bottom, there are certain things that must be believed in, even if we only talk about them to make fun of them, right? And one of them is that notion that there's a public sphere and that we can talk through these things. And the moment that you stop thinking that, well, that's the speech that we got last night, okay? But when you really, like when you're too lazy to lie well, right? Like what the actual F, right? If I were going to try to, so what I think is interesting about that and what I kind of work with and think through is this notion that this condition in which you evince a kind of ironic solidarity for the thing that you no longer believe in, and every time you talk about it, you mark the fact that you don't really believe in it. That is a condition that sort of can't be transcended, and supposedly we're told post-war liberalism kind of lives in that space, right? Tragedy, solidarity, and irony, right? Or I'm getting the order wrong, but you know the book I'm talking about, right? So that can never be transcended, that can never be gotten out of. You can, however, learn to live within it, and you can retrace it, and by retracing it, that's what counts for ethics. And I'm going to call this, for lack of a better term, the sort of the middle-brow vocation. So what we have here, and I won't sit you through all this, but this is that Star Trek series. And here's a bunch of letters to the editor. And letters to the editor are actually kind of serious, and the editors take it very seriously. And they put, like, I paid 75 cents for a copy of this, right? And you don't really expect sort of 2 pages of like, why does Uhura have a phaser in panel 2, but not in panel 3? Like, what's the matter with you? Or, in the episode in the issue 3 months ago, you had them fire their aft photon torpedoes at the approaching ship. But like, that a Constitution class ship doesn't have aft photon torpedoes. So what the actual F? And then people have to sort of, and the editors are kind of like, so the editors do a couple of different things. Sometimes they're like, well, gosh, we goofed, sorry. And sometimes they're like, well, the Enterprise did get refitted after Gamma Hydro, whatever docks. So it could be. And sometimes they're like, well, or I ran into Gene Roddenberry at the time. Right. And then a third one might be like, so actually, no, we went back and we checked the Star Trek technical manual from 1975. There was one. More on that in a second. And like, it does show that there are, so you are wrong. Or lastly, you get into this argument about canon, right? Like, Well, how do you know that they don't have AFOs on torpedoes? Well, because I read it. So now you get into a problem that is well known to folks in religious studies and textual hermeneutic theory, right? Which is like, but also like if you were raised in a tradition that values hadith, or if you were raised in a tradition that values oral traditions, or the Talmud or the Mishnah, right? Like critical source attribution, you know something about this. How authoritative is your source? Like the prophet, peace be upon him, always did this and never did that, and therefore it is incumbent upon us always to do this and never did that. And so like, okay, that's a perfectly fine syllogism. The question is like, is your source about what the prophet, peace be upon him, actually did reliable or not? And so if you say, well, actually, I saw that on, episode 38, The Enemy Within, there are aft torpedoes, then you're golden. But what happens if you read it in a Marvel comic book? What happens if it was in the animated series? What happens if it was in one of Diane Duane's novels? Diane Duane is the sort of Faulkner of, that's unfair to Diane. She's like the Hemingway of no, someone who's actually like a reasonably nice man. She's like the George Eliot of Star Trek. You like her, you don't like her, but she meant well, right? She means well, makes you live to be 120. And so anyway, so you have this, and he's like, look, and I don't, so, and you can make all these different sorts of appeals to reason. And now the question is, which ones do you pick? But ultimately, what you are seeing here in this particular case, this guy, Jim Jackson, he's a regular letters contributor. Most people aren't, but there are a few people who are. And they decide this question is important enough that they set aside several issues to discuss continuity, canon. And my question was like, why does this matter? Like, why are they so interested in this? Why is the problem that needs solving? To give you a sense, I mean, where we are now, and it bears saying this, let me, like, in terms of like the history of the franchise, we're kind of here where the bracket is. Where you are now, as we speak right now, all of this stuff has been solved, like resoundingly solved. There is a website called Star Trek Memory Alpha. It defines what is canonical. There's another website called Memory Beta. It canonizes everything that's apocryphal and or pseudepigraphic, right? And everybody knows what is meant when you say apocryphal or pseudepigraphic, not in the context of the Gospel of Judith or Tobit, but in the context of Star Trek, we all know exactly what we mean because you can go to the Daystrom Institute and the Daystrom Institute as a subreddit, and they will tell you. And if you don't like it, you can go make your own website, and many people do, right? But like all of that stuff's been rigorously defined. It's not religious studies, but it's sort of parallel to religious studies. And again, what interested me was the migration of terms and terminology. Even if you're using these things tongue-in-cheek, and I think that people do use terms like canon tongue-in-cheek, right? But at the same time, it's not tongue-in-cheek because people continue to use it. And what happens initially in this series is that the editors will say things like, gosh, gee, we're not sure. Here's how we try to, something to understand, right, is that when we deal with, so first of all, we're in that moment where it's still sort of sketchy to take science fiction seriously. But we're also in a moment where it's really sketchy to take comic books about franchises seriously. Like Star Wars comics or Star Trek comics are kind of the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the food chain, right? And the thing about this, the problem though, is that they're actually doing some pretty good stories and pretty compelling stories. And so then people are like, oh gosh, is Paramount listening? Do they know about the stories you're writing? And Paramount has all these rules with them. For example, they have to invent a whole bunch of new characters because they're not allowed to use Spock, and they're not allowed to use because Spock's dead in this period, right? And so they have to kind of constantly adjust, and they do adjust. But then 2 years later, Paramount's like, oh no, you can only use canonical characters, throw away. And everyone's like, well, what happened to Lieutenant Conan, right? And then it's also, oh wait, so Diane Duane, by way of example, those of you who guys have watched the original series might remember there was this silicon-based life form, the Horta. Yeah. Right, okay, so they have a Horta who becomes an officer in Starfleet, Mr. Marat. And so Mr. Marat kind of comes into the series. And Mr. Ross kind of a great character, right? And like nobody gives a crap about it. And like nobody at Paramount cares. And for a long time, they have to kind of figure it out on their own. Then for a while, and they explain all this in the letters to the editor. We go to Paramount, and Paramount tells us. Later on, they have a canon officer, and that's really kind of a state of the art, right? Like those of you who've been to Disney, right, you know all about this, right? Like every time you go to one of these themed experience things, right? Like there's a canon officer who shows up and says, like, yep, that is what you know, your Green Moon of Endor themed milk drink. That is what it should look and taste like if it is going to be properly Star Trek. And you know, these things matter because, well, yes, it's canon, but it's also a commodity. And you know, we're used to thinking of those things as being orthogonal to each other, but you know, slow down on that, because the thing about these Star Trek comics is they're 75 cents each. And they make, however modestly, a profit, which means that, like, even Daniel Levine in New Jersey, whose parents will never drive him to a Star Trek convention in Christianity, no matter how many times he begs them, no matter how many times he asks them, they just never will. Never will. It's like, I'm not saying that I visited them recently in the shelf community, and like I brought that up with them, and that's why they can't. But no, I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that they never would. But for 75 cents, I can get this. And this is at a time when the internet doesn't exist, when like it's 2 years between the Wrath of Khan and right. And the only other kind of Star Trek there is are fanzines. And fanzines are highly eclectic. Like if you want erotic novels about Kirk/Spock, that's awesome, right? But like, really, all I wanted was like, you know, more Mr. Spock arching his eyebrow and saying "indeed," right? And like that, and also there's barriers to entry to those things, right? Like you have to know who those people are, you have to know how to find them, which means you have to go to the convention and so on. Okay, so anyway, that's roughly where we are, and so why does all this stuff matter? Okay, well, so I want to suggest something called a middle provocation, and I want to kind of map it out with whatever time I have left. 3.5 minutes. So if you want, like, just have a read of this while I talk. This is.
Did you make it like the slideshow? Just because I.
Oh yeah, I can do that.
Just
yeah, make it bigger. Yeah. Okay.
We'll give you a few more minutes since you came back. Bed and breakfast.
The basic story here. This is Lieutenant Bryce. Lieutenant Bryce is in love with Mr. Konam, who is a Klingon, who is a pacifist, and has defected from the Klingon Empire to the Federation, and has since become an officer on the Enterprise. And she falls in love with him, despite the fact that he served on the ship that killed her dad, and it's the story of like, well, this is the first love affair of its kind, and they come to this planet where there's a Klingon outpost, and there are some human Klingon children. We're given to understand that those relationships were not consensual, and those children were not loved or valued or raised. We encountered one. And, you know, now she's got to ask herself, wait, am I ready to marry this guy? Because maybe we can't have children, or if we do have children, maybe they can't belong anywhere. Like, into what worlds do they enter? And so she has this conversation with Spock. And the thing about reading this, if you read it, it is uncanny how it sounds like Trek, right? May I submit, Lieutenant, that if the unknown is what you fear, that you may wish to change your vocation, right? Like, what have you come to Starfleet for if you're going to back down now, right? And I really that's Trek, baby. Like, you like it, you don't like it, but that's what it is. Similarly here, this is later on, Sarek, Spock's father, and Spock is half human. Spock has all these emotions that his father is uncomfortable with because of his human side. This is not because Sarek loves his wife dearly, Amanda Grayson, very accomplished, but he kind of expected his kid to toe the line and doesn't quite know what to do with him now. And now goes, well, you know, I'm married to this woman. By the way, you should know that Vulcans have a longer lifespan than humans do. Sarek is confronting the fact that he will outlive his wife by many, many decades. And he cannot live without her. And not being human, he doesn't have friends. But his son has friends. And he says, so like, what's it like to have one? And how do I get one? Right. And it's like, well, it's a human thing, but it's kind of like, and anyway, you can go through it, right? But again, you will feel this in it. So what do I mean by middle brow location? I'm borrowing, I want to use middle brow in three different senses. First, in the sort of literary sense, as something which strikes a balance between, if we think of literary as that which juxtaposes form to function, right? And you get meaning from the fact that the form and the functions are juxtaposed. Middle brow literature classically works within and tries to stretch the boundaries of, but basically works within a given set of aesthetic vernaculars. Right. That is to say, the novel that you're reading should not be too experimental because it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be relaxing. It's supposed to be accessible. It's supposed to not make you feel stupid. Now, to be sure, you can press and you can educate, but also it's middle brow because it's supposed to educate or uplift or enlighten, because most of the readers of these novels are, we're told, in the classic literature, right? They're knowledge workers who come out of non-elite universities. This new class of people that have an education that allows them to do some kind of deep reflexive something or other, but they are not sent to Eton and Oxbridge where they're taught Latin and Greek and they read Lord Bolingbroke and so they need sort of synthesized, not synthetic in the artificial sense, but synthetic in the sort of holistic. Well, think of Hans Morgenthau, 6 Principles of Political Realism, and like what Hans Morgenthau is said to do for the middle class, corn-fed University of Chicago undergraduates of the 1950s was synthesize everything from St. Augustine to the present about political realism without having to learn Greek or Latin, so that you can then go on and like when you go work in your father's law firm, you'll know that you should vote for Eisenhower and not for Goldwater, right? So you've got that notion of the middle brow. And if you look for George Eliot as sort of the classic example of this, and George Eliot has long passages where she says to the reader, like, look, I'm writing this way because I want to teach you to love people this way. Right. And okay. So middle brow also in the sense that we got from before, that it's in the middle of something. That you do not get to live within the metronome of industrial society. You do not get to set it. Your authority comes from the fact that you are an expert, you are not an intellectual, you are not Jean-Paul Sartre, right? You are Raymond Aron, right? You're smart about something, you have experience in something, you know about something, right? You're Isambard Brunel, and he's telling you the best engineer in the history of the world, right? And he's telling you that you cannot build a tunnel under that because it's a swamp. And that's not like, and whether you're Queen Victoria or whoever, like you listen because he's an engineer and you aren't. That's what I mean by expert authority. But you accept the hegemonic rules of the game. Right? So you are in the middle. That's why the condition in which you find yourself is one that you have to adapt to. And there is, and it's middle in the third sense, there's a middle management component. Right? So again, think back to Star Trek. Captain Kirk is constantly getting in trouble because of the Prime Directive. He's constantly breaking the Prime Directive. But the point is that he has to explain himself to somebody, and then somebody has to go like, yeah, okay, Jim, you're fine. And even if it's pro forma, right, he does not get to say like, you know what, F this noise. Like, I'm Anakin Skywalker, and I can intervene whenever I want, right? And so these are modes of idea which are supposed to inculcate respectability, right? And this is a key story about Star Trek, and maybe I'll stop here and just pick it up with Q&A. The stories are compensatory also. One of the stories that we're told about Star Trek is that people like it because it made possible an optimism that was ubiquitous after the Second World War, that the UN or the League of Nations or something would work. That the Federation is that, and that the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything that happened after 1945, like the Cold War, all that is wrong life. All that is what should not be. So it's compensatory in the way that the West Wing is compensatory, right? Like you live in the George Bush administration, you should not have had that. So you get, here's your dream house where you get to live it out. And like people like you never invaded Iraq, like we didn't waste the peace dividend, and we actually got to, right, this is what we did with it. And so this is compensatory in that sense. And thus it keeps hope alive for that. The problem, of course, is that it isn't really so much the League of Nations. Like it's what they're really nostalgic for is kind of the British Empire circa 1930s, the sort of Commonwealth. And you know, the thing about the Commonwealth is that it was super racist. It was super like it was less imperial, it was less hierarchical than the empire that preceded it, but it was not in fact egalitarian. And it was not like its particular brands of pluralism were in fact how they spoke. You know, there's the last thing to say about all this is that in the end, that you're dealing here with something like melodrama rather than tragedy. If tragedy is these singular events that happen to people from which we observe and we learn from them, here what you're really dealing with are stories that repeat themselves endlessly again and again. Think about police procedurals and right, you know, right, like it's the exact same story every week. And the purpose of it is not that you have a singular experience of like, oh my God, thank God, you know what? My fortunes could reverse myself, and I would have, you know, Antigone, she was a princess of the city, and look what happened to her. I mean, that could happen like, you know, like we all live with the God, we all live the mercy of the gods. And that's a thing that you're supposed to know once in a while, but then you go on with life. This is not that. This is like every week you're going to watch the same show over and over and over again because you need to be refreshed, reminded, brought back into like the story is the same. That's so in the case of Star Trek, right? In the original series, the incidental music is the same week after week. If you look at like this is why we get so obsessed with original details, you know, like the Star Trek doors, right? They make fun of it in Futurama, right? Why do those things matter? Well, because that's part of what ushers us back into this familiar world where things work the way they're supposed to, where the metronome ticks along the way it's supposed to, where the things that we're suspended between are the things we wish to be suspended between, where like the Federation is the Federation is the Federation, and you like it, you don't like it, but it is the thing from which you are alienated that you know, right? Keep working in the colonial service, like get your 20-year pension. Yes, you'll be an alcoholic, but you'll get a distinguished service order, and like at a pension, and you can reach torque, and you know you can verbally berate your in-laws, and like just like your father and your father's father and your father's father before him, and that is the good life. That is what happens.
There it is.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Oh, man.
I mean, like that's a lot to put on a 75-cent comic book, right? But like they're always.
I was just having a picture come to 2 days ago.
Thanks for this invite questions from the audience, both online and here in person.
Yeah.
So let's talk about canon for a second, because the notion of canon in Star Wars is obviously very, very different than what you presented us with here in Star Wars. There's a kind of rough democracy of Star Trek canon where yes, Paramount sort of controls a few things, but certainly the way Star Trek novels are processed, right? It's like fans voting with their purchasing. So you can have multiple inconsistencies in Star Trek novels, and the one that sells the best sort of like catches on and becomes canon. And until you had Memory Alpha, there was no attempt to really kind of sum it up. As opposed to Star Wars, which was always meticulously controlled. Like in the beginning there was George, and you know, George just said, and that was it. And then George delegates it to Leland Chee, who becomes keeper of the holocron, and you have the 5 levels of canon thing that goes in, and then sort of Disney buys in and modifies things and so on and so forth. But it's always much more tightly controlled. So there's in the Star Wars franchise, there is a right answer to what is canon.
Right.
Like there is always a right answer to what is canon. Whereas in Star Trek, there's not. It's much more kind of fluid, it's much more flexible. So I guess the question I have for you, two questions. One of them is, in your reading, is that sort of accidental to Star Trek, or is that core to something about the way Star Trek, A, as science fiction, and B, as a certain kind of liberal fantasy, liberal secular science fiction, like organizes itself? Because like, you know, Star Wars likes democracy as a word, but Star Wars itself is not administered in a very democratic way. It never has been. It's always extremely hierarchical in terms of like who kind of runs the thing. And I wonder if that difference in the way canon is sort of discussed and administered has some implications for this kind of middlebrow paideia that you're sort of trying to get your hands around here. Because it seemed to me, just off the cuff, that it might be much harder to have something like that functioning in a hierarchical canon system than it would be in some place where you can kind of negotiate canon. But one place in Star Wars where you can sort of see this is the pushback when Disney decanonized the expanded universe novels.
Yeah.
And there was huge fan investment in that universe that had been created, even though some of it was awful. Yeah, even though some of the expanded universe novels were awful because they were written by Kevin J. Anderson, but like there was still great affection for that, and you even see now some of the themes and characters. Thrawn is the best example, who's like really well elaborated in the expanded universe novels, and then he kind of bleeds back in. And I'm sorry, I'm going to totally like super geek for just a second here, but I actually asked Timothy Zahn this at a convention.
That's starting now.
Yeah, but even more, because I got a chance to chat with Timothy Zahn at a convention one time, and I asked Zahn, like, how is it that you're able to do the sort of, you did the non-canonical stuff, it's now been decanonized, but now you're like writing canonical novels. Like what happened there? And he kind of gets his grin on his face. He's like, because I own the copyright. Oh, like he owns Thrawn. So so Thrawn is like his. And so anytime Disney wants to do something with Thrawn, like they kind of need him to be involved. So he consulted on Rebels when Thrawn shows up. Like if you look carefully in the credits, like he's listed as somebody who's which is of course the credits way of saying he got paid. So he actually like owns that character. Interestingly, he does not own Mara Jade. He does not own Mara Jade Scott. So there's some weird thing about that. He owns Thrawn, which is fascinating. So he's been able to write now these canonical Thrawn novels. So you can see this bleed through. And again, I don't want this all to be about Zahn, but my point is the place you can most see a kind of democratic renegotiation of canon or small d sort of approximate democratic renegotiation of canon in Star Wars is the way that there's so much fan pressure for the expanded universe. That some of the expanded universe stuff is now bleeding back in and kind of being reincorporated into canonical stuff. So you've got Thrawn coming back in. There's some thought that when they do the Rey film, that's going to be bleeding back in some of the New Jedi Order stuff from expanded universe. So there's these interesting kind of overlaps there. I don't quite know what to make of that, but I do know that it's radically different than the kind of canonical system that you're talking about for thinking about Star Trek. So I just want to throw that out there and get you to kind of react to that.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that is to say, yes, I think it's more liberal. Like famously, so one of the foundational stories about Trek is that it's the viewers that saved the series, right? That they wrote to Paramount and they told Paramount that you got to bring this back, and then Gene kind of messed it up because that was the season that got you Spock's brain and the Gangsters of Triskelion and all these sort of embarrassingly bad episodes that just maybe better not have been made. And, you know, Star Trek: The Motion Picture was kind of a mess. Both Shatner and Nimoy really don't like the fame that they find themselves thrust with. They are not making money off it because that's before all that. Nimoy wrote a book called I Am Not Spock. Most of it is about like, look, I keep trying to get these acting jobs and like people, you know, I want to be Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof. Like he's from this traditional Russian Jewish family and like he's got all these ambitions. And it's like, yeah, we don't want Tevye being played by Mr. Spock, right? And Shatner, until that Saturday Night Live sketch where he makes fun of himself and he tells the viewers to get a life, right? Like that's when he kind of learns. There's this learning process he gets where he stops resisting it because he thought of himself as a young Shakespearean lead and had played Shakespearean leads, and that's why he was so good at those speeches, right? and he had to learn to accept the career that he had. And all of that and he got taught that by the fans. Right. And so you're right. I mean, I think Roddenberry is, Abraham Lincoln is an honored member of the Republic, and like whatever he has to say, we want to hear it, right? George Washington is a member, is a citizen, is a primus inter pares figure, but there are other ways to become important to the polis, and so yes, it is designed, it is meant to, but it's not because those guys wanted that or intended it, or because they're particularly nice about it. It's because Roddenberry simply didn't know what he had, and Trek is enough before Star Wars that most, like at least in most of the sources I've read, like the kind of fan-built universe that you then hand over to the corporation to manage for you, that Trek is the thing that creates that template, right? Trek is the McDonald's, right? It's and later it becomes a business model, right? But so by way, I know I'm going on too long, but by way of example, Roddenberry tries in the 70s to sort of monopolize the sale in Star Trek tchotchkes. And he kind of can't, because like nobody is listening to him. And he's like, he says all these things and he's like, hey, I'm the great bird of the galaxy. Like that's the nickname of him, right? He's not L. Hubbard. Right. And so I think that's the
Where Lucas learns from that and writes the residuals into the contract for Star Wars.
Yeah.
All of that franchise system.
I'm just going to read something that just came in the chat. And there's also the cynical take on the fan pressure narrative, which is that EU stuff and unused drafts and concepts are already owned by Lucasfilm pre-Disney and Disney post-purchase, and the incorporation of already extant material prevents, with the extremely notable exception of Grand Admiral Thrawn, ownership issues within the creation of new characters.
But by way of example, by way of contrast, like if you were one of the reasons why Diane Duane is as widely respected as she is because like Paramount took over some of that stuff. Yeah. And like what that meant was that people really liked it, right? It got an electric, right? And so in that sense, like, and now I mean that's an odd disregard. I mean, if we were talking about blues and Elvis, we'd be like, isn't that great? Like Elvis took it over and he's making a ton of money off it, right? Like, how smart is Leadbelly, right? Like that's not the discourse we have, right? The discourse we have is that like that's being stolen and co-opted, right? But here that's actually like no, like that Starfleet Academy started out as a comic, right?
To nerd out in a different way, to maybe sort of connect some of these things. I'm sort of going back to Patrick's question to Sarah about slow moving violence, right? And I think we've sort of established we don't really have a sort of on-screen depiction of that because we have the planet killing, right? The sort of like abrupt, immediate, massive. And sort of to like bring that to Jesse's presentation, is watering the plant slow moving hope? Right. And so can we sort of like play with the temporality of violence and hope, right? So slow moving violence, hard to depict. So we get planet killers. Fast moving hope, I think, is really hard to envision and sort of skirts the bounds of unrealistic, right? And so do you have to have a slow moving hope to make this sort of unfold in the realistic sense? And here's where the nerdy part comes in, right? So is the slow moving violence the mirror universe in Star Trek? Right, which is this constant grind of the imperial, right? It is the empire. We depicted quite clearly in Discovery, but I think in the original series, right, we get the mirror universe episodes, and then William Shatner self-aggrandizes with 3 mirror universe novels, right, that connect the sort of long history of Trek, and we see that as a slow-moving violence, the sort of silent creeping of the galactic empire that we don't see on screen. Right, but I think we see because Trek is serialized. Yeah. Right, and so like, how do we think about this temporality of violence, of hope? What possibilities can be depicted and what can't? So for all of you to think about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question comment. I'll just say not understanding the mirror move.
Fair,
So when Burke talks about affect, he uses the phrase channels of affinity. And he references how, really via Aristotle, that affects and emotions, however, moods, vibes can have a certain shelf life. And that it's really hard to be thinking about them without that temporal dynamic. And I do think that that's one of the reasons why there, for instance, has been such a understandable allergy or hesitation or concern about like rage, right? That rage burns you up. It burns things up quickly. I do think that hope is interesting insofar that like hope becomes kind of, you're right. I don't think I can off the top of my head imagine a quick hope. Hope seems to literally be that thing that's sort of like ambient if it's existing, right? And I think that that's one of the reasons why sometimes it's easy to be myself included, like critical of hope, where it's like it feels as if it's a type of presumption. You know, it's like, oh yeah, we hope, you know, and it sort of robs us, I think, sometimes in those understandings. But in terms of, again, that hope in relation to violence and the speed and temporality there, that's a really, really great comment. And I just want to say that again, like I'm encouraged by and want to uplift that particular point about thinking about not only them in conversation with one another, but to be thinking about them within space, time, and temporality.
Just super quick on this, just for both of you, I mean, if you guys know John Lear's notion of radical hope, right? This form of hope that cannot name the object that it envisions, because that object, right, hope is said to be politicized, right? Like just sit around and hope and maybe things will get better, right? So like, no, so we're gonna hope, like we are hoping against hope for something, for a life that is full and rich, even if we cannot envision. And that necessarily has a temporal component. And the example he uses, right, he never talks about the Holocaust, right? Like his sole focus are the Crow Indians. And he talks about Plenty Coups and this particular kind of rhetoric that Plenty Coups uses, and imagining a world in which there will be people that understand themselves to be pro and feel themselves having affinity to us, but obviously they cannot count Coups anymore. And so we cannot picture that. And then he says, look, you know, 3 generations on, maybe that exists, right? And I think that might be a fun way to think through that, because that gives that its space without the full weight of the depoliticizing. Bonnie Hellick has written a bit about this. I have really just copied her.
There's, I think, maybe one more question, as we have around somebody.
Yeah, I mean, just Jesse, I mean, this is a question probably for somebody who's like, you know, surveys the full universe. But you know, the example of the plants really brings up this notion about the, you know, the organic versus the mechanical, as a, you know, which is a broad theme, that in some ways that moment maybe is kind of about, and speaking to this broader question and a broader theme that I think you know, extends, you know, across the universe.
Well, and I will just say that, again, not knowing as much about Star Trek, I do believe that that's a conversation that Star Wars is a lot further along in some ways, like the notion of the ghost in the shell and how droids are sort of like, do droids have souls, and are they, again, like the Force, can they be connected to the Force? And I think that sort of move to be thinking about it sort of in that, you know, like a cosmic sense, it's kind of like where the fun is. So yeah, no, I think that's a smart fun.
Kairos. Wait upon the Lord. Right, wait for opportunity.
Not to open up a giant can of worms, but with the plants, one of the things, one of the corollaries I thought of was pets.
Oh,
And there are pet, you have, so Jabba the Hutt has a pet on a leash that's called, his name is like Salacious.
Salacious meat crumb.
Yeah, right, but also like something that I was like starting to play with and couldn't get there, but like Star Wars is a pretty bleak view of childhood until you get Bix being pregnant and opting out and leaving, right? Because you have, so Mon Mothma's daughter is Lita, I did have to look it up, right? But you think of like what happens to like Force sensitive kids. So you get like Ezra and Anakin, and childhood's basically destroyed. They basically get shunted into some sort of like religious training, right? Lita gets married at 16 for basically purposes of the rebellion, right? And then who else do we have as children? Like, and then you have a bunch of
Jyn Erso has this.
Jim's basically a child soldier who then winds up in the delinquent. A bunch of them have been in like juvenile, like they've they've been incarcerated as children, like. There's a bleakness to that where it's like, and I wonder if they're trying to remedy that with Bix's pregnancy, but also the fact that. I wonder what it says where they're like Bix, and we all know why Bix leaves, we don't need to relitigate that, but like. That she has to be away to actually be pregnant and have a child, when this is actually an issue that like plenty of rebel groups have solved in various ways. Like there's an interesting conservatism to that.
And it does remind me, I don't know if y'all have seen the One Battle After Another, like that particular sort of scene where again, like there's a target practice with a machine gun while very visibly pregnant. And so it's another example of, again, like that sort of detachment or disconnect from the fight. Right? Where it's like, I gotta push pause on it. You know, like that's a really interesting point that I think you're right. It's like in a lot of Star Wars. But I do want to come back to and think about later more of this sort of weird lacuna regarding pets. It's a good point. Yeah.
Just because we had a Trek Star Wars panel, I wanted to mention an observation made by, I think it was the writer of the novelization of Episode 8. Is it The Last Jedi? On a panel at the Atlanta Comic-Con that was called like Star Trek, Star Wars, different two sides of the same coin ? And this writer brought up an observation that said, he summarized the difference in the world, that Star Wars is about people who are, kind of not meeting their emotional and material needs, like what happens to them in that situation. And Star Trek is about, what do people do when they do have their material and emotional needs met? I thought that was a kind of interesting way.
They become adjusted.
Well, we have time for one more question or comment, and then we'll break before a final panel. The thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.